This is a fun one. This one's going to blow your mind. Today we're featuring an iconic song, a rock song, that never so much as placed on the Billboard Hot 100, even though there's no doubt it should have. You'll be surprised when you hear what song I'm talking about. This track was released as a single by one of the most badass bands around. It's part of their debut album in the late 70s, one of the greatest ever. It got no love though. Fast forward to a decade later, and to add insult to injury, this song was sampled without the band's permission for a number 2 hit. Later, the two parties almost came to blows over it. Was this straight up thievery? Or is there some possible explanation for ripping off a song without the band's consent? Great story coming up on a rock classic on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you remember wearing Guess jeans or Z Cavaricci back in the day, you're going to love this channel of deep musical nostalgia, or you'll dig it. There's something on here for everybody. Make sure to subscribe below, click the bell so you always know when our latest and greatest come out. Also, check out our merch below on our Patreon. Oh man, it's time for another edition of our show, Number One in Our Hearts. This is the one that honors songs that were so undeniably great. They absolutely should have been number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart, but for whatever reason, radio play, lack of marketing, label support, or just sheer foolery, these songs came up short. Today's episode from Van Halen's 1978 debut album, Jamie's Cryin'. Now, the beginnings of Van Halen go back to the 60s in Pasadena, California, when adolescent brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen formed their first band, the Broken Combs. Growing up, the two each played several instruments, with Eddie even spending some time on the mic. Though that didn't last, various iterations of the Van Halen brothers band would follow through the years, including outfits called Trojan Rubber Company and Genesis. And by the early 70s, they were going by the name Mammoth. Not long into the decade, Eddie on guitar, Alex on drums, they recruited David Lee Roth, a young David Lee Roth, to sing lead, after which they would also settle on bass player Michael Anthony. Now, by 1974, Mammoth established themselves on the Los Angeles club scene, the LA circuit, playing a mix of 60s and 70s cover songs and hard rock originals. The band's first break came when Kiss's Gene Simmons caught one of their gigs, of course. He was blown away by their intensity, Eddie's raw power on the guitar, and Roth's flashy style. Simmons produced a Mammoth demo. However, it was rejected by labels across the board. It's crazy. It's like when the Beatles were rejected. The guys then discovered that the name Mammoth was already registered to another band, so at Roth's suggestion, they went with Van Halen over Eddie's Rat Salad. Rat Salad, wow. I think that's funny. On the strength of Gene Simmons' glowing reviews, producer Ted Templeman checked out a Van Halen gig, and he, of course, was likewise impressed by what he saw and heard, even writing a letter of intent on a napkin. Templeman then convinced Warner Brothers Records to sign the band on the spot. Prior to recording their first album, Templeman had Van Halen cut a massive 30-song demo, essentially recording their complete catalog in a single 2-hour session. This strategy allowed Templeman to get a solid feel for how Van Halen worked in the studio, and it helped him figure out which tracks they should include on the wondrous debut album, right? As Eddie Van Halen remembered it, he said, and I quote, "Before we went into the studio to do the first album, we did a demo tape for Warner Brothers. There were like 30 songs on it, and afterwards we picked songs from those for the first album. But after we did that demo tape, we came up with other songs like Ain't Talking About Love and Jamie's Cryin'. They weren't on the original demo. Now, after the demo session, Van Halen wrote an additional 5 songs, 4 of which would be chosen for the album, like I said, including Jamie's Cryin'. Van Halen finally got to record their eponymous debut at Sunset Sound in August of '77. By this point, they narrowed the list of songs down to just 9 rockers. With Templeman in the producer chair, the members of Van Halen set to work creating their onstage sound in studio. Basically, Templeman recorded Van Halen live with the band in one sound booth, and then Roth was singing in another one. The idea was to capture the raw spontaneity and the hard-hitting intensity of a Van Halen show. This meant that minor mistakes made it onto the record. That was okay with them. It was all part of the album's charm. Afterward, Ted Templeman then added some overdubs, but more or less he kept it to a minimum. What you get is what you hear. What you hear is what you get.
She knew he'd forget her.
Surprisingly, the album was finished in just 3 weeks at the cost of about $54,000, which was really cheap for back then. Then it was promptly shelved until Warner Brothers could put together a marketing campaign. Meanwhile, Van Halen hit the road to work on building their following, build some momentum. 4 months later, on February 10, 1978, Warner Brothers Records finally dropped the album. And it hit listeners right between the eyes. There was nothing like it on the radio. I mean, if Boston started the rock and roll war of the late 70s against easy listening and disco, Van Halen more than finished it. After people heard this album, they were picking up pieces of their brain off the floor. It blew everybody's minds. It wiped the slate clean for the 80s to really start. Van Halen absolutely exploded onto the US rock scene. Eddie's lightning-quick solos with his signature finger-tapping technique ushered in a new era for hard rock. And David Lee Roth's over-the-top performances and undeniable wit further added to the band's massive appeal. Van Halen was young, they were sonically powerful and completely charismatic. And their musicianship put their hard rock contemporaries on notice. These guys were here to stay for the long haul. Now, Van Halen, the album, received widespread critical acclaim, and within a month, it was sitting at number 19 on the Billboard 200. Much bigger than its chart position, though. Within the year, the record would sell 2 million copies, ultimately on its way to over 10 million units sold in the US alone. The record would also spend an impressive 169 weeks on the Billboard charts, which if you're doing the math is like 3 years. At just over 35 minutes in length, with every song under 4 minutes, this LP is concise and to the point. 3 US singles were released, beginning with a remake of the Kinks' 1964 hit, You Really Got Me. Following that came Runnin' with the Devil, and then today's feature, Jamie's Cryin'. Now, just for reference, 2 more singles were also released in Japan. The killer kick you in the ass track Ain't Talking About Love and On Fire. But let's get into Jamie's Cryin'. As mentioned, this one wasn't part of that massive 30-song demo that the band recorded for Ted Templeman back in the day. Meaning it wasn't part of Van Halen's repertoire while they were cutting their teeth on the Sunset Strip. Jamie's Cryin' was a song that was written in studio. As the story goes, Eddie Van Halen was playing around with this riff and Templeman and Roth heard it. And they both loved it. It energized them. They thought it had the potential to be the backbone for an album single. As Diamond Dave remembered, he said, and I quote, "We heard Edward fooling around with his guitar between takes and we yelled, 'Hey man, that's just what we need on this album.' As it was, this would be the only song on the album that was written in the studio, and it came together in like 10-15 minutes. The rhythm track for this song was recorded on Eddie's Ibanez Destroyer Shark. According to Templeman, when it was time to record the song, they had most of the melody completed, but that was all that there was at that point. The song was still missing some essential components like the bridge and, of course, all the lyrics. So DLR, he came up with an idea to write the lyrics about a high school romance that did not last. Reportedly, he got the idea from a 2-note lick that Eddie Van Halen played in the song that sounded like someone was crying. That's what it sounded like to him. That's where Jamie's Cryin' came from. I think that's so cool. Knowing David Lee Roth, it's kind of surprising though. You know, Jamie's Cryin' takes the perspective of a girl who's turned down a chance for a one-night stand. Roth, well known for his late-night escapades, sings lines like, "She saw the look in his eyes and she knew better. And she knows what love is for. It should mean a little more." The cocksure frontman wrote the lyrics after all, and instead of getting the girl, he gets denied. He dissed himself in this song. You think about it. When it came to the vocals, David Lee Roth was actually kind of perplexed about how to approach Jamie's Cryin. He kind of got into his head a little bit. He was worried that he was going to screw this one up. So to take the edge off, his raspy voice, he laid off his typical regimen of alcohol and smokes the day before he was supposed to record the vocals. And then after a couple of takes, Ted Templeman could hear that something just wasn't right with his voice. He started to give Roth some serious crap about it. But after David Lee Roth explained what was up, Templeman told him, "You need to return to your usual diet and thrash your voice up a little bit here." Afterward, when he did that, he nailed the vocals.
It should mean a little more.
Jamie's Cryin was actually part of a 5-song sampler EP that Warner Brothers put out ahead of the release of the debut album. This was in January 1978, and the advance record was not available for sale. It was only released to radio stations. The extended play had exactly the desired effect, as it secured the band's significant airplay and introduced the public to Van Halen. But as for Jamie's Cryin as a single, that would have to wait. A favorite of Eddie's, he was disappointed to find out that Templeman picked You Really Got Me for Van Halen's first release. Said Eddie, and I quote, "Kind of bummed me out. Ted wanted our first single to be someone else's tune. I would have maybe picked Jamie's Cryin just because it was our own song." So Jamie's Cryin would ultimately be released on May 16th of 1978. A promo video that was shot at the Whiskey A Go Go would accompany it. This is, of course, before MTV.
Now Jamie wouldn't say all right.
But as far as a chart position goes, Jamie's Cryin didn't have one. Both You Really Got Me and Running with the Devil placed on the Billboard Hot 100, but Jamie's Cryin failed to chart at all, at least back in 78. And I think it would have gone top 10 if it was the first single from the album, maybe top 20.
She wants to send him a letter. Yeah.
But turns out the song would hit the top of the charts a decade later. But it would be because it was stolen from Van Halen. Here's where the story gets really crazy. A decade later, thanks to a 2-hit wonder rapper Tone Loc, Jamie's Cryin claimed co-ownership of the number 2 spot on the Billboard Hot 100. Tone Loc, aka Anthony Terrell Smith, wrote Wild Thing with producer Matt Dyke and rapper Marvin Young. Of course, Young better known as Young MC. He'd have his own hit soon after that with Bust a Move, great song from the late 80s.
Says she wanna dance cause she likes the groove, so come on Fatso and just bust the move.
Apparently Matt Dyke came up with the title Wild Thing after he heard the phrase in Spike Lee's movie She's Gotta Have It. Young MC then wrote the lyrics, and then Tone Loc voiced them.
My queen, if you know what I mean, let's do the wild thing.
Now, at some point during the writing process, Matt discovered the Jamie's Cryin riff. Inspired by Rick Rubin's rap rock crossover hits with the Beastie Boys and Run DMC, Dyke incorporated Jamie's Cryin into Wild Thing. It sounded phenomenal.
For your right.
As it was, Tone Loc's Wild Thing was built entirely on a looped sample of Jamie's Cryin, using parts of the song's intro as well as some of the guitar licks. Licensing, this is the 80s, it's practically an afterthought in this era. A free-for-all sampling, and reportedly a flat fee of $5,000 was paid to Van Halen for the use of Jamie's Cryin for Wild Thing. However, the deal was struck by Van Halen's management without consulting the band at all. They did not expect that Wild Thing would do anything. That's why they didn't tell the band.
Ooh, I was once like you and I like to do the wild thing.
Eddie found out about his stolen riff when he was watching MTV. Afterwards, he was fuming. Alex Van Halen would say that when he heard Wild Thing over the radio, he didn't realize it sampled Jamie's Cryin until he recognized his tom-tom breaks in the track. Afterwards, a civil lawsuit was filed by Van Halen. However, any courtroom drama was averted as the two parties settled the dispute out of court. Van Halen apparently agreed to receive $180,000 in a payment for the sample and was subsequently credited on future copies of Tone Loc's album. Not that the band was exactly happy with the terms. For example, Alex said, and I quote, "At least we got something. Tone Loc and his people made millions out of it." And that's true, they did. Incidentally, later on when Eddie Van Halen and Tone Loc crossed paths, they were anything but friendly. Tone Loc recalled, and I quote, "I ran into Eddie Van Halen one time. He was uptight and a little tipsy. Claimed that I took money from him. I don't think he really believed that, but maybe he did because he was tipsy and you say what you feel when you're in that zone. Maybe he didn't get the proper royalties for it, I don't know. He's lucky I didn't just sock him in the jaw, but I was chilling." Yeah, I think it's the other way around. If I were Tone, I'd be a little afraid. For Tone Loc's sake, it's probably a good thing that Eddie kept us cool. I mean, think about it. Have any of you heard the story of how Eddie pulled up on Fred Durst along with an assault vehicle sporting a gun mount? This happened years later, but I guess Eddie had left some of his equipment at Fred Durst's house and the new metal rocker refused to answer his phone. Hell-bent on getting the stuff back, Eddie basically rolled up in a tank. He went nuclear on Fred. He walked up to the door. He was bare-chested in jeans and combat boots. He was toting a gun in his hand. Turns out after that, Fred was willing to cooperate. So Eddie stood there on the front lawn of his Beverly Hills home, smoking a cigarette and pointing a gun at Fred Durst as he hauled amps and guitars from the house to the assault vehicle. Pretty badass. Royalty disputes aside, one positive thing that did come out of the whole Wild Thing affair. The rap song put a bigger spotlight on Jamie's Cryin. Whereas the track had failed to chart back in its day, it didn't make much of a splash in pop culture media either. It did get a placement in Howard Stern's 1997 movie Private Parts. But beyond that, not much. So on the other hand, fair or not, Wild Thing has a slew of media placements. It's a long list and includes the John Candy flick Uncle Buck, Doogie Howser MD, Chicago Hope, Bedazzled, The Animal, Charlie's Angels Full Throttle, Taxi the movie, the Angry Birds movie, and most recently it was used in The Boys. So while the whole situation is suspect, at least the story of what happened is out there, and Jamie's Cryin has gotten more exposure because of this. In terms of covers, Jamie's Cryin has a fair share of artists giving it a go, from Train to Corey Taylor to Steel Panther to Toad the Wet Sprocket. And there's also Weird Al. He used Jamie's Cryin, the sample, for his song Isle Thing, a Gilligan Island spoof of Wild Thing that he included on the UHF soundtrack.
I'll find.
But where does that leave us? Where does that leave Van Halen? I mean, there is no doubt who has the bigger legacy. There's no doubt which song is better. Tone Loc has no song without the Van Halen brothers. I mean, the guitar and the drum duo, that's what makes the song so exhilarating. But just for kicks and giggles, let's go back to July of '78 when Jamie's Cryin was released and see what was in the top 5 on the Billboard charts. You had Frankie Valli with Grease at number 5. At number 4, you had Donna Summer with Last Dance.
So let's dance.
At number 3, you had the Rolling Stones doing their best disco interpretation with Miss You. Then at number 2, you have the all-time classic Baker Street by Jerry Rafferty, which we actually gave number 1 in our heart status years ago. And at number 1, you had Andy Gibb with his 7-week number 1 hit smash, Shadow Dancing, the biggest hit of that year, I believe. So disco was dominating for sure. But I think we can throw Van Halen in there at number 1 and let the chips fall where they may for just 1 week. I mean, thanks to Van Halen in Boston, rock would take over very soon thereafter, and Van Halen would dominate the 80s with 2 different singers at the helm. And exactly 10 years later, Jamie's Cryin would still rule the charts. How about that? Thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about Van Halen and Jamie's Cryin. What are your memories of the song? What is your take on the sampling? Do you think it was fair? The original band or artist is properly compensated. Are you for it? Let us know in the comments. Let us know what you think about Van Halen and about that incredible debut album. Let's have a great discussion. If you like our content, we invite you to subscribe to be a part of this. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.